June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the beaches of Normandy. A German officer named Major Hans Weber stands in his concrete bunker overlooking Utah Beach, watching through his binoculars as the largest invasion force in human history approaches the French coastline. But it's not the soldiers storming the beach that make his hands tremble. It's not even the naval bombardment that has been pounding his positions for hours. It's something else entirely, something he sees rolling off those landing craft that fills him with a cold, creeping dread. Jeeps. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. Small, boxy, unremarkable vehicles pouring onto the sand like ants from a disturbed nest. They keep coming, wave after wave, an endless mechanical tide that seems to have no end. Major Weber had studied American industrial capacity in Staff College. He had read the reports. He had seen the numbers. But numbers on paper are one thing. Witnessing the reality, watching this unstoppable flood of vehicles materialize before his eyes, is something else entirely. He turns to his adjutant and says something that will be repeated by German officers across Normandy in the coming days: "We have already lost this war. We just didn't know it until now." This is the story of how a simple quarter-ton truck, originally rejected by the US Army as too small, became the weapon that broke the back of Nazi Germany. This is the story of the Jeep. To understand why the Jeep terrified the Germans, we need to go back to 1940, before Pearl Harbor, before America entered the war, when the US Army was still a relatively small force trying to modernize for a conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable. The US military had a problem. They needed a light reconnaissance vehicle that could go anywhere, carry troops and equipment, and be simple enough that any soldier could drive and maintain it. They had motorcycles, which were fast but exposed. They had heavy trucks, which were powerful but cumbersome. What they needed was something in between, something that didn't exist yet. In July 1940, the US Army issued a requirement to 135 American automotive companies. The specifications were demanding, almost impossible: create a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle weighing no more than 1,300 pounds, capable of carrying a 600-pound payload, with a wheelbase of no more than 75 inches, four-wheel drive, a fold-down windshield, 3 bucket seats, and a flathead for mounting a machine gun. Oh, and they needed a working prototype in just 49 days. Most companies took one look at these requirements and walked away. It was too fast, too demanding, too risky. But 3 companies decided to take the challenge: Willys-Overland, Ford, and American Bantam Car Company. American Bantam, a small company on the verge of bankruptcy, submitted their prototype first, the Bantam BRC. It was crude, it exceeded the weight limit, but it worked. The Army tested it and was impressed, but they had doubts about Bantam's ability to mass-produce vehicles. Willys-Overland came next with their quad prototype. It was heavier than specified, 2,450 pounds, but it had something the others didn't: a powerful Go-Devil engine producing 60 horsepower. This little engine could climb slopes that stopped other vehicles cold. Ford submitted their pygmy prototype last, bringing their massive manufacturing expertise to the table. The Army took the best features from all 3 designs: Bantam's compact design, Willys's powerful engine, and Ford's manufacturing know-how. The result was the vehicle officially designated Truck 1/4 ton, 4x4, but which would soon be known around the world by a much simpler name: the Jeep. The origin of the name Jeep is debated to this day. Some say it came from the military designation GP, General Purpose. Others claim it came from a character named Eugene the Jeep from the Popeye comic strip, a creature that could go anywhere and do anything. Whatever the origin, the name stuck. By 1941, Willys-Overland had won the primary contract, with Ford producing identical vehicles under license. The Ford version was designated GPW, G for government contract, P for 80-inch wheelbase, W for Willys design. Between 1941 and 1945, Willys produced 363,000 Jeeps and Ford produced 277,000, a total of 640,000 vehicles. To put that number in perspective, Germany produced approximately 50,000 Kübelwagens, their equivalent light vehicle, during the entire war. America was building Jeeps at a rate of nearly 13 to 1. But sheer numbers alone don't explain why the Jeep became such a psychological weapon against the Germans. To understand that, we need to understand what the Jeep represented and what it revealed about the fundamental difference between American and German approaches to warfare. Germany and America approached military vehicle production with completely opposite philosophies. Understanding this difference is key to understanding why the Jeep had such a devastating psychological impact on German forces. German military vehicles were masterpieces of engineering. The Kübelwagen, designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself, was a brilliant piece of work, lightweight, air-cooled, remarkably fuel-efficient. German trucks like the Opel Blitz were well-designed and capable. German tanks, whatever their flaws, were technological marvels with sophisticated engineering. But they were complicated. They required skilled workers to build and skilled mechanics to maintain. They used specialized parts that weren't interchangeable between different models or even different production batches. A bolt that fit one Panther tank might not fit another Panther built 3 months later in a different factory. Germany's entire military-industrial complex was built around craftsmanship and precision engineering. It was a system that produced excellent individual vehicles, but very few of them, very slowly, and at enormous cost. America took the opposite approach. The Jeep wasn't elegant. It wasn't sophisticated. It was a box on wheels with an engine. But it embodied a completely different philosophy: standardization, interchangeability, and mass production. Every Jeep was identical. A Willys Jeep built in Toledo, Ohio, used the exact same parts as a Ford GPW built in Detroit. A bolt from one Jeep would fit any other Jeep, regardless of manufacturer or production date. This wasn't just convenient, it was revolutionary. Henry Ford had pioneered assembly line production with the Model T before World War I, but by World War II, American industry had refined mass production into an art form. The Jeep embodied every principle of this philosophy. It had only about 30 moving parts. Any competent mechanic could tear one down and rebuild it in a few hours. Soldiers in the field could swap parts between damaged vehicles to create working ones. If a Jeep was destroyed, another identical one would arrive to replace it within days. The Jeep was designed to be produced in enormous quantities by semi-skilled workers in factories that could be quickly converted from civilian production. Willys-Overland's Toledo plant had been making civilian cars. Ford's plants had been making tractors and automobiles. Within months of receiving the contracts, they were churning out Jeeps at rates the Germans couldn't comprehend. A single Willys plant could produce more Jeeps in a month than Germany's entire automotive industry could produce Kübelwagens in 6 months. But it wasn't just about quantity. The Jeep's design philosophy represented something deeper, a fundamentally American approach to problem solving. Where Germans sought perfection, Americans sought effectiveness. Where Germans built vehicles that required expertise to maintain, Americans built vehicles that any farm boy from Iowa could fix with a wrench and some wire. Where Germans created vehicles optimized for specific tasks, Americans created a vehicle that could do everything adequately. The Jeep could be a reconnaissance vehicle, an ambulance, a cargo truck, a weapons platform, a command post, or a tow vehicle. It could mount a machine gun, a radio set, stretchers, or supplies. It could ford rivers, climb mountains, cross deserts, and navigate jungles. It wasn't the best at any single task, but it was good enough at all of them, and that was exactly what the American military needed. The Germans had studied American industrial production before the war. They knew about Henry Ford's assembly lines. They understood American manufacturing capacity in theory. But they had fundamentally misunderstood what American mass production meant in practice. German military planners believed that quality would triumph over quantity. They believed their superior engineering and tactical skill would overcome American numerical advantages. They believed that producing 50,000 excellent Kübelwagens was better than producing 640,000 adequate Jeeps. They were catastrophically wrong. When German forces encountered American units in North Africa in 1942, they began to understand their mistake. American vehicles weren't as well engineered as German ones, but there were so many of them. When Germans destroyed an American Jeep, 2 more appeared to replace it. When a German Kübelwagen broke down, it might wait days or weeks for spare parts that had to be shipped from Germany. When an American Jeep broke down, parts were cannibalized from another damaged vehicle and it was back in service within hours. But it was in Normandy, on June 6, 1944, that the full reality became unavoidable. This is where we return to Major Hans Weber, standing in his bunker, watching the invasion unfold. The scale of the D-Day invasion was unprecedented in human history. Over 156,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6. Behind them came the logistics train, the supplies, equipment, and vehicles needed to sustain this massive force. And at the heart of this logistics system was the Jeep. In the first 48 hours after D-Day, over 3,000 Jeeps rolled off landing craft onto the beaches of Normandy. Within a week, over 10,000 Jeeps were operating in France. Within a month, over 30,000. The Germans had never seen anything like it. German reconnaissance reports from the days following D-Day make for fascinating reading. Officers describe endless columns of American vehicles. They report that replacement vehicles arrive faster than we can destroy them. One report states, the Americans appear to have an unlimited supply of light vehicles. We destroy 10, and 20 more appear the next day. But it wasn't just the numbers that shocked the Germans. It was what the numbers represented. Every Jeep rolling off those landing craft was a message. It said, we can produce these faster than you can destroy them. It said, we have so much industrial capacity that we can ship thousands of vehicles across an ocean just to support one invasion. It said, you cannot win a war of attrition against us. The Jeep became a symbol of American industrial might in a way that even tanks and aircraft couldn't match. A Sherman tank was impressive, but it was a weapon, it's supposed to be produced for war. A B-17 bomber was formidable, but it was a specialized military aircraft. But the Jeep? The Jeep was basically a motorized wagon. The fact that America could produce them by the hundreds of thousands, ship them across the Atlantic, and deploy them in every theater of war simultaneously was a demonstration of industrial power that the Germans simply couldn't match. German soldiers began calling the Jeep the devil's messenger because it seemed to be everywhere at once. German military intelligence estimated that for every German vehicle on the Western Front, the Americans had 15. And they were right. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. German soldiers and officers who had believed in ultimate victory began to doubt. How could Germany win a war against an enemy with seemingly infinite resources? How could they fight an army that could replace every loss immediately? The Jeep answered these questions every time a German soldier saw one. It said, "No, you cannot win. We will simply outlast you." But the Jeep wasn't just psychological warfare. It provided real, tangible advantages that changed how the American military operated. The Jeep's mobility transformed battlefield tactics. American units could move faster, respond quicker, and maintain communications more effectively than their German counterparts. While German officers rode in slower, heavier vehicles or relied on motorcycles, American officers rode in Jeeps that could keep pace with advancing infantry, climb to observation points, and evacuate quickly under fire. The Jeep's versatility meant that American units were incredibly flexible. A single Jeep could serve multiple roles in a single day, carrying ammunition to the front line in the morning, evacuating wounded in the afternoon, and serving as a mobile machine gun platform in the evening. This flexibility was something German forces, with their more specialized vehicles, couldn't match. Perhaps most importantly, the Jeep enabled the American military's revolutionary logistics system. The U.S. Army in World War II was the most mobile, best supplied military force in history up to that point, and the Jeep was the foundation of that system. Supplies moved from ports to depots to forward positions in Jeeps. Medical evacuation relied heavily on Jeeps. Communications networks were maintained by Jeeps carrying radio equipment and signal corps personnel. Reconnaissance was conducted by Jeeps. Command and control functioned because officers could move quickly in Jeeps. Remove the Jeep from this system, and the entire American military machine slows down dramatically. The Germans understood this. They targeted Jeeps whenever possible, but it made no difference. For every Jeep destroyed, replacement vehicles arrived within days. The production pipeline was so robust that losses in combat were irrelevant. In 1944, at the height of Jeep production, American factories were producing over 600 Jeeps per day. Even if the Germans destroyed 100 Jeeps a day, which they couldn't, America would still be gaining 500 Jeeps daily. It was an impossible equation for Germany to solve. This brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of the Jeep story: it wasn't just used by Americans. The Jeep became a weapon of Allied unity. Under the Lend-Lease program, the United States supplied Jeeps to virtually every Allied nation. The Soviet Union received over 50,000 Jeeps. The British received tens of thousands. Free French forces drove Jeeps. Polish units drove Jeeps. Even Chinese forces fighting Japan received Jeeps. This created a kind of mechanical standardization across the Allied forces that had never existed before. A Soviet soldier in Belarus, a British soldier in Italy, and an American soldier in France were all driving essentially the same vehicle. They could share spare parts, maintenance knowledge, and tactical experience. Meanwhile, German forces were using a bewildering array of vehicles, German designs, captured French trucks, requisitioned civilian vehicles from occupied territories, even horse-drawn wagons. The contrast was stark. The Allies had one light vehicle, produced in massive quantities, available everywhere. The Germans had dozens of different vehicles, produced in small numbers, with incompatible parts and different maintenance requirements. From a logistics standpoint, it was a nightmare for Germany and a dream for the Allies. The Soviet reaction to the Jeep is particularly telling. Soviet vehicles were generally rugged and simple, the Soviets understood harsh conditions and difficult maintenance situations. But even they were impressed by the Jeep. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov, one of the most successful commanders of World War II, said in his memoirs, "We could not have won the war without American trucks. They provided the mobility our forces needed." While Zhukov was referring to all American vehicles, the Jeep was a crucial part of this mobility. Soviet forces used Jeeps for reconnaissance, communications, and command functions throughout the latter part of the war. The British, who had their own tradition of military vehicles, also came to rely heavily on the Jeep. British officers particularly appreciated the Jeep's reliability and ease of maintenance compared to some British designs. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of British forces in North Africa and Europe, regularly traveled in a Jeep and appreciated its utility. One of the most famous photographs of the war shows General Dwight Eisenhower riding in a Jeep with Montgomery and other Allied commanders, a powerful symbol of Allied cooperation, made possible by American industrial production. The French resistance and later Free French forces relied heavily on Jeeps supplied by the Allies. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, many of the vehicles racing through the streets were American Jeeps driven by French soldiers. The Jeep became a symbol of liberation as well as American industrial might. But perhaps nowhere was the Jeep more appreciated than in the Pacific Theater, where its versatility and ruggedness were tested to the extreme. While the Jeep shocked the Germans in Europe, it proved equally valuable against the Japanese in the Pacific. The Pacific Theater presented challenges unlike anything in Europe. Dense jungle, extreme heat and humidity, poor roads or no roads at all, mountainous terrain, and the constant threat of tropical diseases made logistics a nightmare. The Jeep thrived in these conditions. Its four-wheel drive allowed it to navigate jungle trails that would bog down larger vehicles. Its simple design meant it could be maintained even in primitive conditions without specialized tools or facilities. Its compact size allowed it to be loaded onto small landing craft and unloaded directly onto beaches. In island-hopping campaigns from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, the Jeep proved indispensable. On islands with no ports, Jeeps were driven directly off landing craft through shallow water onto beaches. On islands with limited infrastructure, Jeeps could navigate narrow jungle paths that tanks and trucks couldn't traverse. American forces in the Pacific used Jeeps in ways that would have seemed impossible based on the original specifications. They were driven through rivers, up volcanic slopes, and through jungles so dense that visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. They carried supplies to isolated positions, evacuated wounded from forward aid stations, and served as mobile fighting platforms with mounted machine guns. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Japanese light vehicles were limited in number and capability. Much of Japanese logistics in the Pacific relied on human porters, animal transport, or light trucks that couldn't handle the extreme terrain. When American forces advanced with their Jeeps, they could move faster, supply their troops more effectively, and maintain communications more reliably than Japanese forces. The contrast was even more stark than in Europe. In one engagement after another, American mobility, enabled by the Jeep, allowed U.S. forces to outmaneuver Japanese defenders, bring up supplies and reinforcements quickly, and evacuate wounded efficiently. The Jeep saved countless American lives by getting wounded soldiers to medical treatment quickly, often making the difference between life and death in the critical first hour after injury. By 1945, as the war approached its conclusion, the Jeep had become the most recognizable symbol of American military power alongside the Sherman tank and the B-17 bomber. But unlike those weapons, the Jeep represented something more than just military might. It represented American industrial efficiency, practical problem-solving, and the ability to produce what was needed, when it was needed, in the quantities needed. When the war ended in 1945, the Jeep story was far from over. Surplus Jeeps flooded the civilian market. Farmers used them to work their fields. Businesses used them for deliveries. Civilians drove them as everyday vehicles. The Jeep became an icon of post-war America. But more importantly, the Jeep had taught the world a lesson about modern warfare. World War II proved that industrial capacity matters as much as tactical brilliance. Germany had excellent generals, well-trained soldiers, and sophisticated weapons. But they lost because they couldn't match Allied production. The Jeep embodied this reality in its purest form. It wasn't the best vehicle. It wasn't the most sophisticated. It wasn't the most comfortable or the fastest or the most powerful. But it was good enough, and there were enough of them, and that made all the difference. The German officers who watched those endless columns of Jeeps roll off the landing craft at Normandy understood something that military historians would spend decades analyzing. They weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting an industrial system that could not be defeated by conventional military means. Every Jeep was a message written in steel and rubber: we can produce more than you can destroy. We can replace our losses faster than you can inflict them. We will win not through superior tactics or better soldiers, but through sheer, overwhelming material superiority. This was the lesson of the Jeep. This was why German officers felt their hearts sink when they saw those columns of vehicles. They knew they were looking at their own defeat, spelled out in thousands of identical quarter-ton trucks. In the end, the Jeep won World War II not through any single dramatic action, but through cumulative effect. Every mission it accomplished, every wounded soldier it evacuated, every message it delivered, every supply run it completed, multiplied by 640,000 vehicles across every theater of war, added up to victory. The humble Jeep, originally designed in just 49 days by companies desperate for a government contract, became the vehicle that changed the world. It showed that American innovation wasn't about creating the most advanced technology, it was about creating practical solutions that could be produced in massive quantities and used effectively by ordinary people. That was the real weapon that terrified Nazi Germany. Not the Jeep itself, but what the Jeep represented: an industrial democracy that could mobilize its resources on a scale that totalitarian regimes could never match. When Major Hans Weber said the war is over after watching those Jeeps roll onto Utah Beach, he was right. The Germans just didn't know it yet. But the Jeep did. And now, so do we.